Ramboy Panganiban says his family feels lucky if they are able to eat 3 times a day. He used to earn an equivalent of $6 a day selling food, but now he says he's happy if he's able to bring home 4.
We've been hungry since March. In the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, we finished off the very little cash we had. And since we couldn't really go out to work, we just borrowed money.
Many people here are in a similar position. They used to be part of what the government calls the informal sector. They are either self-employed or run businesses providing goods and services. But now they tell us many people here have lost their jobs, and some have resorted to begging. And it isn't happening in the capital, Manila, alone. Local survey shows at least 7 million families have experienced hunger at least once in the past 3 months. That's a record high of more than 30%, the highest incidence of hunger since 2014. The survey comes as the country is well into its 7th month of community quarantine, one of the longest ever implemented by a government in the world. The Philippine government imposed a lockdown when the coronavirus pandemic broke out. But it pushed the country into one of its worst economic recessions in decades. The government says it is doing the best it can. It has given out cash to millions of Filipinos and says it hopes to give more.
Kaya nga po tayong nagbubukas ng ekonomiya.
We are saddened about this. That is why we are reopening the economy to restart jobs and to generate more income for those most affected.
But others say more could be done.
There has been permanent damage done to livelihood, to jobs, and there needs to be a more sustained response to this problem. I think we need to dispel that notion that there isn't enough funding. There is funding, it's just not being used in the more appropriate interventions. There is enough funding for infrastructure projects of local politicians.
This is a community inside one of the country's top business districts. People here tell us life has always been difficult, but now they fear it is getting worse. Jamela, Alindogan, Jazeera, Manila.
We're going to expand this discussion now with Isabel Fry, Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, on Skype from Johannesburg. Isabel, thank you for joining us. Why don't we talk specifically about South Africa, first of all, an African country which was hit very hard and which already had to deal with inequality and haves and have-nots. How much worse has it got, in your opinion?
Thanks, Kamal. As you point out, South Africa was facing dire economic inequalities prior to the impact of COVID. So we have one of the highest inequalities in terms of income and wealth. Our poverty levels, more than 1 in 2 people were living below the poverty line, 1 in 4 people with daily starvation. And in addition to that, our unemployment, in terms of formal unemployment, was 40%, and that was in the first quarter of 2020. What we've seen since the impact of the formal lockdown from March is skyrocketing levels of poverty and unemployment. In fact, our unemployment figures were released earlier this morning. What we've seen is that the formal labour market itself has shrunk. So far more people are now dependent on livelihoods that they can scrape through informal economic activity. Unfortunately, as a result of the fact that there is such widespread poverty, there are very few people who can support the informal economy. And so you have a very negative cycle of poverty, which reinforces poverty. And then, of course, the formal sector of the economy, that very small elite formal sector, continues to grow with the commodity export. So we're seeing a huge...
Sorry to interrupt you, Isabel. Do people have any, it's a strange word to use here, but hope? Is there any hope that things could start to improve, return to the levels they were, if not get better, at least get them back on an even footing?
It's a really important question, and I think on a day-to-day basis, that hope that might have been there increasingly shrinks. What we saw at the beginning of the lockdown was a really strong response by the state, the rollout of cash transfers to people, and the hope that that would increase with time. What we've seen is that fewer and fewer people are actually becoming eligible for the receipt of this. And so as the unemployment grows and the impact of unemployment on sort of family handouts and that kind of indirect support increases, people's hope is becoming far less strong in terms of future recovery.
Obviously, you specialise in South Africa and Africa, but I think the problems that the government faces there are replicated in many other places, and the simple fact that they've gone into recessions, money is not being generated, and the amount a government can do can, long term, it could end up being quite limited.
It is a really tough situation. What we see within the SADC region is that a lot of the income is generated by commodity exports. That continues, but the question is how much of that is retained by the state in terms of tax, as opposed to being taken out and beneficiated by countries globally. I think that for our region, the global supply chain is really precarious. So the exports of a number of goods, such as cut flowers, for instance, that affects people's livelihood. The question is also, however, political will and priorities. If the state is determined to spend on people's well-being, that kind of financial financing can be found, whether it's global, international funders or borrowers.
Isabel Fry joining us from Johannesburg. We thank you very much for your time. Do appreciate it.
Thank you.